heard about abduction of children. This is probably the fifth summit during which we discussed this topic. And didn't only we hear about it, we made other people hear and talk about it. We have President commenting on how he's ready to rescue children. We have the First Lady actually getting involved in what seems to be the rescue of children. What's next? Most in our advocacy, we talk about stealing of children itself and how important it is to save them. Well, how can we ensure their safe reintegration, rehabilitation? How can we ensure accountability? How much do we know and learn every day about the crime itself and Russian system of indoctrination and abduction of children? These are the questions that I invited the esteemed panel of speakers to answer, and I'm very happy to introduce each one of them. We have Sylvia Allison, who is a senior advisor in the UAS of the organization each of you know, Save Ukraine. Sylvia specialized in education and organizational learning in crisis-affected regions, and Save Ukraine rescues, rehabilitates, and reintegrates children from occupied territories and from abduction. We have Gillian Hubner, Executive Director of the Collaborative on Global Children's Issues at Georgetown University. Gillian is also advisor in the Government of Ukraine initiative Bring Kids Back. She's a child rights specialist and focuses on strengthening community-based systems that supports children's well-being in times of crisis. We have Caitlin Howarth, Director of Conflict Analytics at Yale's Humanitarian Research Lab, where she helped launch the Ukraine and Sudan Conflict Observatories. And of course, each of us used in our advocacy the reports that produced by Yale. We have Chelsea Sobolik, the Director of Government Relations at the World Relief. And if you haven't heard of World Relief, you definitely should, because it's the largest evangelical refugee resettlement agency in the US. And Chelsea and her organization have been heavily involved in advocating for the return of abducted children, especially with the White House. And we're happy to have Peter Pomerantsev joining us. Peter is Senior Fellow at Johns Hopkins University. He's also the author of multiple books and works on propaganda. The recent one is How to Win an Informational War. If you haven't read it, please do. He's a co-founder of the Reckoning Project, which documents Russian war crimes and counters disinformation. Please welcome our speakers. Sorry, I sounded better in my mind than I am in reality, so bear with me. First question I'd like to ask Caitlin. We've all been following the work of Yale's University on investigating and documenting the crime of abduction and indoctrination of children. And recently you produced yet another report where you identified multiple locations where children have been taken and types of locations and the involvement of Russian government in the effort. Could you please provide us the key highlights from your report, and most importantly, what did not get into the report and we should know?
Thank you so much, and that's a really great question. So there is always a lot of information in these reports. This was the fastest one that my team produced, and fortunately that helps to keep it brief on all the information you have to know. Our team found that we've identified 210 locations, which meant that we newly identified 156 places that Ukrainian children have been taken to. Important to know, these are locations that Ukrainian children have been taken to at some point. They are not necessarily located there currently, but they are part of the broader network that Putin's people have been taking children to across the Russian Federation and the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine. 39 of those locations have been used for the militarization of Ukraine's children. So that militarization means it's been some combination of combat training, drills, education in military history, and even some kind of composition of, sort of like building weapons. I want to come back to that because that's a little bit of a tricky one. There have been 2 new cadet schools that have been built in this time. There have been 49 of these locations were also expanded compared to pre-2022 baseline imagery, satellite imagery. That, I think, is one of the key things that I really want to highlight here. Of these locations, so many of them were significantly expanded. So these are new facilities that were being built. They were significantly refurbished. We're talking about a really huge infusion of money being put into making sure that more children, more people could be brought to these places, and that they could support significant amounts of new activity over time. I also want to highlight in particular the Voin program, which means warrior. This is a program that has significantly expanded across the occupied territories of Ukraine, as well as across Russia. And it's specifically expanded to Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia, including with new facilities being built starting in 2024. We were not able to release those images as part of our last report. They weren't cleared in time by the State Department, but we will be able to release them in the future. And there's one thing I think is important for everybody to kind of take away from this is that there are facilities that are being increasingly custom built for the sole purpose of militarizing Ukraine's children. You've already seen reports, this has already been out in a lot of the excellent Ukrainian media and even Russian independent media like Verska, which has done great work, talking about the investigative committee and how it has developed specific cadet programs just for Ukrainian youth. Well, we can also see that the Snigiri Young Patriot Center, this is developed by the Presidential Property Management Department. This is purpose-built to re-educate and militarize Ukrainian youth, not Russia's youth. And it has already taken through multiple rounds of children for that explicit purpose. So this is the kind of thing that we're monitoring very, very closely.
Thank you for the overview, and you reminded me of a very important point to focus on, the budget. For those who will go to the Hill, you have access to resources on abduction and militarization of Ukrainian children on Klitsch, and a one-pager like this, where we specify the budget that Russia allocated on militarization of children. Since 2022, the expenditures on youth policy in the federal budget increased by 66%. So since the invasion of Ukraine until 2024, the increase on the budget to indoctrinate youth increased by 66%, from $513 million to $850 million. This indicates for us that Russia does not plan to stop, and Russia prepares the army for the future. We can talk about it later, but you can point it in your advocacy as a number and an evidence of Russia's systematic policy that does not plan to stop. I have a next question for Peter. Your organization, Reckoning Project, work on bringing justice in court, legal, and in court of public opinion, and bringing justice to victims in times when Russia defies and ignores international law is pretty difficult. Could you tell us how your organization plans to bring justice? What mechanisms are you exploring?
It's a really good question, Katya, and there is a overall sense of deep despair across the world around the possibility of accountability. And we do a lot of polling around this. We try to understand how people across the world feel on this topic. And, the greatest risk is not so much Russian disinformation around crimes. I mean, that's a very grave threat. So when it comes to the issue of the kids, they are quite successful in putting out the story that they're just helping the kids. But we can overturn that. You can fight that. You can push back against that. The most dangerous thing is people feeling a total despair around any chance of accountability. And it's much more Putin's narrative like, yeah, I'm going to do this, so what? Which is actually much more powerful. So in polling, we largely do polling in Europe, we see people saying there should be justice on something like this, but then thinking nothing is possible. And that emotional danger, that despondency totally opens up a world where Putin's total lack of respect or care about any rights of victims, let alone any kind of international law, wins. So you're right, a lot of the time we're fighting despondency. I think it's very important right now to open the aperture of what we mean by justice. Obviously, this is less relevant in America, but in Europe, and especially in Ukraine, there is a sort of almost a fetishization of The Hague. No, we'll see Putin in The Hague is always the response. The Hague is coming for you. When actually anybody who's worked with the ICC or around international law knows how little power it has. And that's a very bad fetishization. Yeah, there's this fixation with like a Nuremberg moment, a sort of deus ex machina. It's a very kind of religious idea, isn't it? It's like from the heavens, a judgment day will come. And sadly, maybe it will one day. But right now, we're living in a very different environment. And actually, once you step back and think about justice as a complicated web of mechanisms, then actually we have more mechanisms than ever before to scare the living daylight out of people who do bad things. We actually have way more opportunities if we start to understand the weapons that we have. Now, we've been working a lot on universal jurisdiction. So we've opened cases in Argentina, for example, on torture. We know how Syrian generals were caught in Germany. So universal jurisdiction, the idea that you could actually hold people accountable in different courts across the world is one approach. But it's not only criminal cases that matter. So we're looking a lot, not just at the abduction of children, which is a criminal issue. Anybody involved in that is involved in a crime. We're also looking at indoctrination, militarization, which is much more a human rights issue. Yeah, that's different. Where you would hold Russia accountable as a state in the ICJ, at the UN and other places. And the mechanisms that get released then have got to do with sanctions, but also with money. Yeah, there is more opportunity than ever before to extract financial compensation for people. And there's a big push on that at the moment. And once we get into the weeds of what's happening on the occupied territories, there's actually so many opportunities. Firstly, indoctrination, which again is not a crime in the criminal sense. However, is an abuse against children's right to have their own identity, against the rights of the child, maybe against freedom of thought, which is one of the fundamental human rights. And we can start saying, Russia, these things that you're doing, which is part of an old imperial Russian practice, they did it in the 19th century, the 20th century, is actually a crime. This would be the first, not a crime, this would actually be something that you would be held accountable for. But this would be the first time it's being done. Yeah, the politruki, the sort of like head of pioneer camps of Komsomols, they generally get away with it, historically. Yeah, this is actually the first time where lawyers are thinking, hold on, we can get them on this. We can get the people who are managing the system of indoctrination. They always escaped. Even at Nuremberg, only the head of the Hitlerjugend was indicted, the very head. The rest got away with it. We don't usually focus on this. Yeah, some people might refer to it as cultural genocide, the forcible destruction of identity. So this is right now, we're in the moment where the first time we can hold Russia accountable for what it's doing. And then beyond that, when we think about justice and accountability, we think about naming and shaming, sanctions against individuals. We think about the whole supply chain of abducting of children. And then we can think about how do we start to pressure every company, every person in that node. Everybody knows about Lyubova Belova, the head of the Russian, their ombudsman for children, who's been indicted by The Hague. Not everybody knows about her sister, who is a businesswoman in Pielce, who manages orphanages and makes a lot of money by managing orphanages. Where do you think the Ukrainian kids are going? They're going to those orphanages. This is a business scheme. Everybody involved in that business scheme can be held accountable in lots and lots of different ways. So the moment we get away from the hope of The Hague delivering justice, of Putin and Nuremberg, and we start thinking about the whole supply chain of people responsible, when we start thinking beyond criminal to larger human rights violations, we start thinking about the financial mechanisms that can be applied, actually we're in a very exciting place. You know, OSINT researchers, and we've got people from the Yale team here, can do incredible things, knowing every person in the network, yeah, what they own, where their children are. We know that now. We didn't know that in the Gulag system. We had no idea who was holding Vasil Stus, you know, in Mordovia. We had no idea. Now we know every person, and every one of them can be targeted in a specific way. Yeah. So I think this is actually a very exciting time. What it takes is research. And yeah, the Yale lab have, I think, really transformed this field. It takes a lot of research, it takes focus, and it takes a really precise understanding, almost acupunctural, of what will be the pain points to the system. So it's an exciting time, but also a very difficult one.
Thank you. I think you gave all of us a little bit of hope in this, what seems hopeless time. I think my favorite justice warrior now is Lindsey Graham, who offers to designate Russia state sponsor of terrorism for abduction of children. That's one of the ways we can use the issue of abducted children, not only to return them, but to demand accountability and pressure on Russia. And my next question I want to ask Sylvia. Save Ukraine and British NGO War Child, you released your own report around the time before Yale released theirs. But yours is unique in a way that is based purely on testimonies of 200 children that you rescued. Could you tell us about the findings and, most importantly, the stories that you gathered preparing this report?
Thank you. Yes, the report was released around the first week of September, and I wanted to I printed out a copy before I left home because I wanted you all to see this and look for it. It is, and it's falling apart, it is groundbreaking. It's the first time that, that there's been sort of documentation of interviews of around 200 children, 200 youth who have been rescued by Save Ukraine, and to tell their story, so to corroborate the research from Yale. And there is very significant corroboration. At least half of them, 55% of them, report forced indoctrination, whether it's through being forced to learn through the Russian curriculum, being prohibited from speaking Ukrainian, from singing Ukrainian songs, as was mentioned earlier, being forced into paramilitary and militia groups. These are children who are under the supervision of military personnel, and then being punished for expressing anything pro-Ukrainian. Another 41 to 45% spoke in detail about their experience of militarization. So again, corroborating the report, boys and girls being forced to handle weaponry, demine, build trenches, do mock fighting. And then in terms of the number of centers, the number of camps that are coming up, there's also record of children being transferred periodically or at regular intervals from camp to camp as well. So they keep them moving. 10% have experienced direct violence. Heartbreaking, one of the most and this report is full of such stories. I think one of the more heartbreaking stories is a story of a 16-year-old whose friend had some chat lines of Ukrainian soldiers on his phone. He was discovered and he was killed through torture. He was found, and sorry for the gory details, but it's important to know this, eyelids ripped off, teeth taken out, fingernails. And the official report was that he died from a blood clot. So this is what children are experiencing. And when Save Ukraine identifies them, either in temporarily occupied territories or on the Russian side, and they shepherd them out of the country, the trauma is visible, really visible, and it takes a while to get through.
Thank you for answer that question so honestly. I think the details are gruesome, but they are important in when we talk to the offices. And we have stats, we have reports, but the testimonies of children, it's something undeniable that we can refer to in our conversations with the offices. Well, how do we know that there are not 20 but 100 or hundreds of children kidnapped? We have testimonies of children. Russia rescues children, isn't she? No, we have testimonies of children. I think this is very important to combat Russian propaganda, referring to those children who have been returned and saved, because their stories are the first-hand witnesses, accounts that cannot be disputed. So a little bit of self-promotion, go to forgetusnot.net and find all the reports and read them, especially the report of Save Ukraine, and tell those stories in Congress, because nothing moves people as much as the stories of children who've endured what you described. Chelsea, I wanted to ask my question to you. You're behind the famous letter of faith leaders to the administration, encouraging and urging it to prioritize the return of children, before finalizing any peace deal with Putin. Conversation about peace deal was very active back then. I remember it was March, it was April, we were all worried. And I think it reached the president himself. But most importantly, it also translated into the resolution HRS 564 and SRS 236 that we actually will be all advocating for. Can you tell us about why it's important to advocate for it, and why the wording in the letter was the way it was?
Thank you so much for having me here and having this important conversation. My name's Chelsea Soblik, and like you mentioned, World Relief, we're the humanitarian arm of the National Association of Evangelicals, and like you mentioned, we're one of the refugee resettlement organizations here. I should say, before I actually answer your question, we actually serve in Ukraine. We have offices all throughout Ukraine, responding to the war, primarily doing mental health counseling in Ukraine. And then here domestically, we actually serve displaced Ukrainians who came over on a program called Uniting for Ukraine. So we're serving Ukrainians here as well. We are a faith-based organization. So I come at this from an explicitly faith-based perspective. I'm a Christian. I should say I used to work on Capitol Hill for many years, and actually got to work on children's issues on Capitol Hill, and I've worked on children's issues for a long, long time. And I always say vulnerable children don't have huge, well-funded K Street lobbyists who are on Capitol Hill every single day advocating for them, especially vulnerable children around the world. They do not have a huge K Street lobbying firm for them. So people who are involved in speaking up on their behalf, it matters so, so deeply. They have voices, but the reality is their voices aren't being amplified and heard in DC. And that's what you mentioned of sharing their stories, helps bring their voice and their perspective to the table here in Washington. But I actually started working on this issue in a previous role, and at World Relief, I care very deeply about this issue. I've spent my whole career in some capacity working on vulnerable children's issues, and maybe to share a personal note, I actually was born in Romania, but grew up in the States. So that part of the world is also very near and dear to my own personal story. But worked on this role and actually connected with Nathaniel Raymond at Yale, and he and I connected. And at World Relief, I said, "Hey, can I work on this here? It's not kind of traditionally what we've worked on." And World Relief said, "We care about families remaining together. We care about displaced people. Of course, you can work on this." And so, as you were mentioning, peace talks were percolating. There was a lot happening in the spring, and I looked around and saw that not many people at all in the faith community were speaking on this issue, and arranged a letter. We had some very conservative groups like Tony Perkins at the Family Research Council, or Tony Perkins leads the Family Research Council. They signed on, the National Association of Evangelicals, the Southern Baptists. We had a number of different groups and denominations sign on to this letter. And what we said is, this is important for the return of children, but coming at it from our faith of every single person on this planet is made in God's image, and children, you all know this, it is always the most vulnerable in times of conflict that pay the heaviest price, and that's women and children. And those children need people to use their voices and their power and their position to advocate for their safe return. So, I mean, I really looked around and saw no one was really leading something, so it really wasn't special. I've led letters like this for 13 years in Washington, but I think the moment was right. The people who signed the letter, it was a really unique collection. And I will tell you, I've done, like I said, work like this for almost 13 years in Washington. I have never gotten a quicker response from the State Department. Within half an hour, they reached out asking to meet with some of the signers who signed that letter. And less than a week later, we were meeting with the State Department on this matter. So we've continued to send letters. We've continued to talk about this, continued to help educate not only Americans, but also the church on this issue and why it matters so deeply. So anyway, I could go on, but really wanted to engage the faith community because it is a very important piece to this conversation, and Christians ought to care about this because the Bible tells us to. The Bible says a lot about the quartet of the vulnerable, the orphan, the father, or the orphan, the widow, and the stranger. And so really honored to have a tiny piece of this. Really grateful for all my colleagues up here, but really, really grateful for your time and attention to this really important issue. It matters. I'm a mom to a little boy, and I've told my husband almost all the time, if my child was abducted, I would want someone fighting for me at the highest levels of power. And so I truly count it an honor to get to have a tiny sliver of this work.
Thank you. I think that Chelsea just provided us with very good talking points when we go, especially to conservative offices. You can refer that this resolution has been drafted based on a letter by conservative religious leaders, and refer to the scripture about our obligation to save children. And from advocacy standpoint, the resolution in the letter kind of draw the first line that we cannot go beyond in negotiations. No line has been drawn before, and abducted children is an easy one to draw. So you can talk and tell it to your congressman. I'm going to go with one more question to each panelist, and you can prepare questions, make them specific, make them interesting. Chelsea, since we finished with you, let's start again. So your experience in engaging local churches in humanitarian work is very valuable. Can you provide us with any tips on how to engage, how to talk to your local church, your conservative representative, or the community that cares about the values?
Great question. I think for engaging on the Hill, I know there's advocacy days coming up. I think it's really important to share that these resolutions and these efforts are very bipartisan. If you've been watching the news, there's not much that's bipartisan these days. But this issue is very bipartisan because it's about the children, and it's about, like you said, drawing the red line in the sand that children must be returned home as a precondition to any peace talks. So I'd really lean in on the bipartisan nature of that when you're doing your Hill advocacy. And I'd share why you personally care about this issue. I don't know each one of you in this room or your story, but I'd share, like I said, I used to work on Capitol Hill, and I usually knew the policy of an issue. What mattered to me just as much was why did a constituent care about this issue? Why did they take their time and money? why did they come to see me and talk about this? I think that really matters. And I think you can translate that if you are a member of a faith community, whether it's Protestant, Catholic, a Jewish, whatever, if you are involved in a faith community, to share within your local context. And I think it's important, should maybe be careful a little bit, but I think it's important for Christians to remember people outside our borders as well. We can certainly walk and chew gum and care about people in our own country, but this is about vulnerable children, and this is about their safe return. This isn't, we can have other conversations, but reminding our church communities that children are precious in God's sight, and the Bible pays special attention to those vulnerable individuals, and so should we. So I'd really make it personal, and I would share the bipartisan nature, but for faith communities, since the beginning of history, faith communities have been the ones involved in caring for vulnerable people. It was Christians who started hospitals. It was Christians who started schools for disadvantaged children. So we have a long history of caring for vulnerable children. We have absolutely not done it perfectly. I will be the first to say that. But I think we have a really neat opportunity to step into this current moment and continue to be a voice and to practically care as well.
Thank you. Gillian, I'm sorry I skipped you in the first question. I'll shoot you two. Not feeling well today, sorry. But you're the one, and I quote you often, who said that this is the largest case of missing children since World War II. You yourself worked a lot on displaced children, children on the move, children in the conflict zones. How did the US and other countries handle it in the past? And what lessons can we learn from the past we can apply today?
Yeah, unfortunately, this isn't new. That's why we have the 4th Geneva Conventions, which give guidance about how to handle situations like this. And unfortunately, that guidance is being completely ignored by the Russian Federation. And we're also not using that guidance in our advocacy enough, I would say. So I think becoming familiar with what the Geneva Convention requires in a situation like this is beneficial to all of us. You don't even have to criticize Russia to say, we need to know who these children are, where they are. We need to ensure that a neutral party has access to them. And we need to be sure that that neutral party is able to facilitate communication with their families. Those are very yesable propositions that should be agreeable to anybody on the planet, no matter what side of politics you're on. What the US government has done in the past, 2 things. We were very prominent funders in the global child rights and protection space, and we leaned in a lot to global coordination on these issues. The funding situation has changed. As you know, USAID has been dismantled. All of our funding related to global child rights and protection is now gone. Yale lost $8 million through funding cuts. Save the Children lost at least $3 million. Save Ukraine lost at least $3 million. So when we hear the rhetoric around how important that is, we can test that rhetoric against budgets. Budgets are moral documents. And if you look at where the funding is on this, we don't see it anymore. So that's a key message, I think, when you're talking to legislators. Thank you for caring. Fund it. When you see how much Russia is spending on this forcible deportation, we need to at least match that. We can't solve this problem through rhetoric alone, or PR moves, or 8 children at a time. They're abducting thousands of children at a time. So if we're serious, we have to match Russia's level of effort.
So if the President Trump one day would call you and say, Gillian, I want to do this beautiful thing and save all the children of Ukraine who were abducted, what do? You would say, fund it?
Fund it. Yeah, I mean, it's...
Anything else?
Yeah, I mean, so the US government actually had an incredible child protection team. So for instance, when Boko Haram abducted 200 girls in Nigeria. The White House set up a task force. We sent a technical team of specialists to Nigeria to help the government of Nigeria respond. Biden didn't do that, and Trump didn't do that either. We funded groups like Yale. We sent a little bit of money to groups like Save Ukraine. But that level of technical expertise going in, this is a priority, boom, all those people have been fired. They're quite willing to help, but if Trump wants to do this well, hire up the team of experts who've done it before and know how to do it again.
Thank you. We will pass the message. Sylvia, I want to talk a little bit about indoctrination, militarization, because it's not only the fact of displacing children from one location to another, it's what happens to them once they're displaced, or even to those who are not displaced, still under occupation. You've documented like 55%, I think, of children that you interviewed endured indoctrinations one way or another. What are the consequences on children indoctrination has, and how do you help rehabilitate from it? What does it take to bring children back, not only physically, but mentally?
Last week, I was working with a colleague who was doing a few focus groups, and these were kids that had been just recently rescued and those that were rescued several months ago. The trauma was very clear. The room was very warm. They wore their winter coats. They didn't speak. They spoke in very short sentences. They were very cautious. This is a result of the indoctrination and the militarization. Children, one child talked about being isolated in a room alone for a long time. He was losing the ability to interact socially. So the biggest impact is obviously psychological. Our case managers are documenting severe forms of PTSD, nightmares, developmental delays, educational delays. It impacts the individual, it impacts the parent, it impacts the family unit. If you're going to attack a country, what better way to rob an asset is to rob the future. So even after you rescue some of these kids, the rehabilitation is going to take a very, very long time. So we're working with, through our case managers, comprehensive support related to psychosocial support, medical support, legal support, training families and parents how to engage with children that have been through trauma, they themselves have been through trauma, and then helping them to reintegrate into communities. But even after that, the need is there. We have people that have gone through the cycle. It's usually 3 to 6 months. And then they're finally reintegrated. We work with 20 churches around the country who help set up these centers to support formal reintegration. They still remain in touch with us. They still need that emotional support from us well after they've gone through our cycle of work. So the road ahead is very long. And to your point about the money, if I just might say, it takes around roughly $4,000 per person, per child, from identifying them, getting their papers, getting the escape route solidified, and then helping them go through the process and then reintegration. We have rescued, Zelensky at the UN conference recently cited that Ukraine had saved 1,600 children. 1,000 of those children were saved directly by Save Ukraine. It is not cheap. It is not cheap. And so thank you for making that point about it takes money. It really does. Every child depends on it, literally. I don't know if I answered your question, but
You did.
say
You
that.
did.
Thank you.
$4,000 for saved life.
That's the cost of a water boiler.
Water boiler. I don't know the price of water boilers, but expensive water boilers, but very, very good deal to save a child. I have a question, continuing the issue of militarization. Caitlin, you mentioned, I think we all kind of knew, and there were reports of how Russia engages, like Russian youth in production of weapons and assembly of weapons, but I think you were the first one who found evidence of Ukrainian children being involved in production of weapons that used against their own country. Can you speak more about that? What are the nuances, what we should know going into the meetings?
Sure. But just before I do that, I just want to say there's one thing I have noticed sometimes, and this is just speaking back to your point on the impact on these children. Having met some of the survivors who've come back, I think sometimes there is a tendency to think, and this is a very cynical view, that if a child is traumatized, they are broken beyond repair. And then for the cynical policymaker who is thinking perhaps, well, we have enough problems here at home, what is the use of the investment in that child? They're a lost cause. These are not lost causes. These are not children who are not worth saving. To me, I hear $4,000 and I'm like, wow, what a bargain. What a bargain. I'm like, where can I give you the 4,000? I'm like, I can make that happen. Are you kidding me? These children are incredible. When you meet them, you would be astonished at what they are capable of. You would be profoundly and forever changed at what they have survived, and also what they continue to do and how they continue to transform their lives. But I'll also tell you the thing that I think any child who has ever gone through this would tell you, is that they shouldn't have to be an inspiration. They should just get to be a kid. I hope if there's nothing else that you take forward, please read the report, learn the story of just one child, know their name, know their story, carry them with you. Because it will change you. It will make you better at everything, no matter what aspect of this war you are talking about. It will help you to bring it forward in a way that's more personal, that is profoundly more meaningful. I can give you 1 million statistics. It won't matter as much unless you are carrying forward a person's story. And that's what that is what the person that you're talking to will remember more than anything else, because you will feel it and they will feel it.
I just wanted to pick up on what Caitlin said about the capacity of these kids. So many of the kids that Save Ukraine has returned are also informing future return efforts. So these kids know how to contact other kids who are in the same situation. That's something that's like intelligence that's worth more than gold, right? I mean, it's not something you can get through OSINT research, right? This is a child's lived experience that is rich with data. And when we invest in the return of a kid like that and the reintegration and in the process of supporting that child and hearing that story, that kid feels empowered enough to say, I know how to help my peers. And that work also takes time. It moves at the speed of trust, which is the most valuable currency that we have. And that's worth investing in too.
Yeah. And it means that they're able to reach back and to be able to tell those who may not get out or may not get out immediately, but that there is hope, that there is a future. And that's everything. That is absolutely everything. Sorry, to get back to the question you originally asked. No, but that was the most important thing I think any of us can say. So I think many of you may have heard in previous reporting about these drone factories where students from the Global South have been getting recruited sort of under false pretenses to come and be like STEM students, and in fact they're actually getting recruited to work in these drone factories and just like manufacture drones that are going to the front. That is not what's happening with these Ukrainian kids. So I want to be very clear. These are different scenarios. What we are seeing, we had essentially, and I want to be clear because this was something that got picked up and sort of blown, I think, a bit out of proportion in some of the media coverage because it is such a sort of spicy thing. What is important for any of you to take away, though, is that these children are being trained in how to operate drones. That's something that we're seeing really persistently across a lot of the training programs. They're being trained in also more advanced types. So this isn't just like, okay, you can, not that it's, harmless, but it would be one thing if everyone was like, all right, you know how to pick up and operate an AK. That would be relatively standard. And frankly, any number of us would also learn the same thing on any given hunting weekend anywhere in the United States, right? It's not violent, but it's also not uncommon. Knowing how to operate an FPV drone is not the same thing. Knowing how to, for example, conduct paramilitary operations or do airborne training, that's different. That is not your average kids camp activity. Training under a notorious war criminal outside of Grozny, who has a record and who is already under international criminal sanctions, that's also not normal. And learning how to do things like throw grenades, how to sort of like do a lot of like weapons disassembly and rapid reassembly, working with, making sure that you are able to put on a MOP suit for gas masks for a potential chemical attack. Again, that's not typical. This is where the kind of imagery for anybody ever seen the movie Jojo Rabbit? Yeah, this is more that's like the nicest version I can give you for what these kids are going through. But it's that's the type of military preparation that these kids are going through. But it isn't yet quite like industrial scale, weapons prep or assembly.
Thank you. That's a good distinction to have. And continuing, finishing the topic of indoctrination, Peter, maybe you can tell us about how are you going to translate in the legal sense the not crime but abuse of children's rights and violation of children's rights to bring justice for not only abducted children, but indoctrination that covers not only those who've been taken to Russia, but 1.6 million children who are under occupation.
Yeah, I think you've made a very important distinction there. From a kind of criminal point of view, it's fairly easy to define the wrongdoing around we don't know how many, 25, whatever, tens of thousands of children who've been removed from their homes and moved across occupied Ukraine and usually into Russia. And the children who are still with their families, children who are still in occupied Ukraine, so they haven't been abducted in that physical sense, but who are undergoing a vast enforced re-education, which includes many, many, many human rights abuses, from their right to read what they want, from their right to have an education in Ukrainian. For example, there are still instances of Ukrainian children in the occupied territories trying to follow the Ukrainian curriculum and online classes, a huge danger.
If I may add, 44,000 children under occupation secretly go to Ukrainian schools online.
Yeah, but with huge risk. I mean, the FSB come round, knock on doors, listen in. The methods of surveillance are both physical and digital. The occupied territories are, at the moment, this vast experiment in digital surveillance. Russia is insisting that you use different types of apps, alternatives to WhatsApp, which basically spy on you permanently. there's physical surveillance, all sorts of other surveillance. Your phones are taken away and checked in schools. So you're doing this at huge risk, and just, neighbors will listen in and inform on you as well. I think there's a two-finger there.
Right, and the consequences, if you are caught, is that your child will be taken away from you. So again, this is where we have this line from the not a crime, but a violation of your rights, to yes, a crime, of fully separating the child, and actually then we get into forcible transfer, of transferring them and actually either sending them to Russia or actually taking the child into the custody of the Russian state. So again, like the blur here, how much you're sitting there right on the line of coercion and then immediately getting into the criminal act. It's all very, very imminent.
Yeah, and also in terms of there's stories of children being taken to the woods and beaten for speaking in Ukrainian. That's obviously a crime. So there are many approaches. There are blatant criminal acts, there's these borderline ones, and then there's this larger idea of stripping a child of their identity. It gets very exciting when lawyers start thinking about ideas like freedom of thought, which is one of the fundamental human rights that has actually never been invoked, or was invoked once in the history of the UN. There's very interesting, I think, parallels to make and synergies and alliances to make with what's going on with the Uyghurs in China and other places around the world. That's a very interesting possible common dynamic and alliance for Ukrainian groups to build. So there's many avenues. That can be explored. If we want to get into the history of it, I can go on and on about this, but I don't know how useful it's going to be for someone doing activism tomorrow. But a term you hear a lot in Ukraine is cultural genocide, which again isn't usually a crime under the Genocide Convention, but it was going to be in the original formulation of genocide, which was created by a Polish lawyer from Lviv, Raphael Lemkin. He actually put the stripping away of a group's identity as completely 100% at the core of the idea of genocide. But that was stripped away when the Genocide Convention was adopted, because virtually every imperial power has done something similar. So, but that's another story. But in a sense, we're trying to return that. In this work, we're going to say, okay, that got stripped away. It's going to be very hard to change the Genocide Convention now. But actually, this work of destroying identity, destroying who people are through this vast and forced social engineering, is actually the essence of what the original idea of genocide was. Yeah, it's completely intrinsic to it, but it was taken out. So in a way, we're trying to make up for something that went a bit warped in the definition of genocide in the 1940s. Using the term genocide, I don't think is very helpful at the moment on the Hill. For other experts will tell you why. I'm not going to get into that debate, but that's what we're doing. I do think there is sometimes a problem we all face when we're trying to describe what Russia is doing in Ukraine, which is it's very hard to describe to people the vastness and the totalitarian ambition of what they are doing. Because the kidnapping of children is horrendous, and we can think about Boko Haram and many other parallels, but it's hard. I don't know how useful it is to communicate this to people on the Hill. Maybe the older ones will understand it. What Russia is doing is something they've done in the 19th and 20th centuries. They can come, move people across, not people, but peoples across the vast Eurasian landmass, take an identity and at the barrel of a gun, force it into people, yeah, especially at children, separate families and re-engineer societies and populations and identities at the flick of a ruler in Moscow. That's kind of something that most countries, if they did do it in the 18th and 19th centuries, it's not something that can get into people's minds. The abduction of children is like the little end of what is really a vast and totally totalitarian project of saying, I'm going to come here, I'm going to kill everyone who's opposed to me, I'm going to take people and change their identity, and I will do that at the barrel of a gun. I think it's hard for people to kind of get their heads around it. This idea that there are still political leaders in the world who think in these sort of totalitarian terms. You know, it's something we know from, obviously, the mid-20th century. I think that's very hard to communicate. You know, it's like, it's hard to get your head around that there are still political leaders who think in these sorts of terms, but that's what they're doing. And the children's issue, the abduction of children is the very obvious criminal, you know, act that sticks out of this vast totalitarian project.
Thank you. We're right at time, but do we have time for maybe 1-2 questions from the audience? 5 minutes. I do not advise my microphone. Let's put it this way.
I have a mic here. Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much. Hello, thank you all for all the work you're doing. My name is Ostap. I have a question. Maybe I'll direct it to Peter, but I'll be curious to hear other speakers' thoughts as well. So after the recent phone call between President Trump and Vladimir Putin, obviously everybody was talking about the Budapest summit, which later was canceled. But there's something else that came to my attention. So according to President Trump, Putin brought up children in their conversation. He thanked First Lady Melania Trump for her involvement and said that, quote, that this will continue. What do you think he's trying to do here? What's his game? What's your take on this? What's his purpose by creating this impression that he is approaching this issue in good faith? What's his goal on this? Thank you.
What's Putin's approach? Anybody willing to comment? Peter, Sylvia?
I would say it's a public media stunt. It's actually what he's telling the children themselves. It's part of their indoctrination, the children and the parents. It's come to Russia, you know, your family is dead, Ukraine is no more, and you'll have a good life. They try to make it as appealing as possible. And so he's trying to be seen as the good guy, you know, publicly. And this is part of the problem with media as well as some of the misconception about what's really going on. On one end, there's millions and millions of dollars being put into a very systematic, strategic strategy that starts at age 0 up until when you're at age of conscription. They have a youth policy in place that details all of this. You'd be surprised in terms of the amount of detail they've put into this. And it's a way to sell it similar to the way that they're selling it to kids, in that you'll be safer, you'll have, you know, a new family, and you'll have, you know, better resources, better education, et cetera. So I personally see it as a media stunt for the international, you know, community.
I think it's an old game of blurring the lines of what's truth, what we can say, what we cannot say.
It's gaslighting.
Anyone else? Gaslighting. My God, anyone else wants to comment?
If I may, I, with gratitude to First Lady Melania Trump for her concern and for her involvement on this, anytime there is a table convened, especially on this issue, but I think anytime there's a table that's being convened, the question that any of us should be asking is, are you at the table or are you on it? So, if the table is here and the First Lady is there and President Putin has also drawn up a chair for himself, if Ukraine isn't at that table, they're on it. That's a very dangerous position to be in. They must be at the table. They must actually be driving the conversation and helping to set the terms on what is happening with their children. I think that to me is just common sense.
Anybody else wants to? Yeah, there was a question.
Thank you. Christopher Sheehan from Rhode Island, my own capacity. I guess this question could go to anybody. Aren't the numbers a lot higher? Didn't the abductions start in 2014 when they stole the Crimea? So we're talking maybe a few 100,000, perhaps? I don't know. I'm just asking. Thank you.
I've actually seen, like, percentages, like 50% of the Ukrainian population, since 2014. So you're right, yes.
And Russia at one point said they had 700,000 Ukrainian children, so. And then they stopped reporting numbers once the ICC warrant went out.
I just want also to emphasize that the way Russia operates changes. In 2014, there have been movement of children. We were not documenting it properly, so we do not really know how many children have been moved. But most abductions take place in 2022, 2023, because Russia moved those children to integrate it into their system. Now that Russia feels more comfortable in occupied territories, instead of moving children, they're expanding their system in occupied territories. Before, they used to move children to Volgograd to enroll them into these military camps. Now they're opening the largest military camp in Mariupol. So there is no need to actually move children as much. So the numbers are definitely higher. The problem is that we do not know exact numbers. We do know it's not 300 children. Let's put it this way. Yale documented 6,000 children. We heard from the government of Ukraine, 19,546. The estimates by many experts are in hundreds of thousands of children.
300 is closer to the number of specific individual children that we identified in one of our previous reports. The true number is vastly greater than that. So we're still in the process of counting. But when we give our one of our previous estimates was still in the high tens of thousands, because again we're usually looking at groups that we're seeing. It's important to understand, being able to identify a specific child. We don't just identify someone. It's not like we put them on the list and say that that's at high confidence just when we have a name. We have to identify the actual name of the child, then we have to trace their journey from where they originate in Ukraine to when they are actually taken, and their journey into Russia. So it's a whole process, and we are exhaustive in our sourcing on this. So that's a very, very high bar for evidence. So that's why so to be able to get upwards of 300 on that is a lot. But that means that there are many, many, many more who have not yet reached that level of confidence.
Can we take another question?
Yeah, I wanted to ask, back on the topic of 2014 and the initial wave of children back then who would have been taken. Right now, from the full-scale invasion, we're 4 years in. So anyone who was a minor, who was under the age of 18, got to be, starting next year, it'll be 4 years. So 14, 15 years old, already a teenager by the time they would have been taken, aging into adulthood now. But that does go back a lot longer to 2014. So do we have any data on people who were taken back then, have aged into adulthood? Anyone who's made it out of Russia, who does advocacy work, that kind of nature?
I read some stories in your report. Would you like to answer, or I can cover it quickly? So data is very scattered. We do not have, hey, this is the number of children that was under occupation in 2014, and now are adults serving in the Russian army. We do have anecdotes. In the report by Save Ukraine, there are at least 3 stories of people, boys, who were underage at the moment of occupation, became of age of conscription under Russian government, and were killed in action during the full-scale invasion. Many of them went through military camps like Yun Armia or Movement of the First. Yun Armia, their target is to ensure that at least 10% of their graduates join the Russian armed forces. So we can see children, people who were children during the initial invasion did do this journey into Russian armed forces and were killed in action, but by who was supposed to be their comrades, right? Their co-citizens. So what is different from 2014 is the scale, the speed, and Russia is not subtle anymore. This number of children will only grow, and I think this is very important to communicate to your offices, especially like cynical, pragmatic national security staffers who care about national security. Are we ready to fight Ukrainian children? At least 160,000 of them already graduated from UN Army and Movement of the First. At least 369 cadet classes opened in occupied territory of Ukraine. Russia has prepared hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian children to fight and die for Russia. Are we ready in 5-10 years when Russia will groom 500,000 of Ukrainian kids to join their armed forces? Are we ready to face children who've been brainwashed since age 6 to die for Russia? Do we have this army capacity? No, because we do not militarize our children. But from national security perspective, this is not only a humanitarian issue. This is the issue of global safety. Russia is growing army of the future. If we do not liberate Ukraine, if we do not save the children, are we ready to fight them? I think this is a point and anecdotes you can support your advocacy for Ukraine. I have to conclude this panel because we're out of time and there is lunch happening. But I encourage you to, first of all, save some of the questions for advocacy training on Monday. I will be leading it and it will be more detailed and I'll be happy to answer your questions, hopefully in a normal voice. Second of all, approach speakers with good, smart questions. They're at your disposal to ask them about all the things that can help you with the advocacy. Good luck on the Hill. And thank you, speakers, for joining us. Continue with the voices.